Hello and welcome to another episode of the Third Age Babylon 5 podcast, once again with a special installment featuring Empire at War. As you might have guessed, scheduling continues to be an issue, and so as we are rapidly approaching the end of the Narn-Centauri conflict, I thought we would take a look at these battles firsthand, replaying some of them in the Shadows at War mod. We will of course be featuring the long Twilight struggle as soon as possible once we can get everybody together for a proper discussion. Until then, let's see how much action we can get into with the Narn as part of the Army of Light in this little battle. We will be fighting the Centauri Republic, of course, although as this mod is set in the Shadow War, there's a good chance we will be encountering some Draka and Shadow vessels as well, just as we are commanding a Rakiri mercenary vessel here as part of our Narn regime vanguard forces. We are playing, as you might be able to see on the left-hand side there, over the map of Coruscant, which in this mod is reimagined as Betalrani, so don't ask me how Narn and Centauri forces have gotten themselves into a battle over an Earth Alliance colony, but in this timeline it seems the war has escalated quite a lot. We will of course be trying to fight with as many non-exclusive forces as possible, which is not too difficult as this mod does imagine them as kind of a backbone of the Army of Light, which I guess is true to the show to some extent, as we will be seeing them featured heavily even after their horrible defeat at Gorash 7. Personally, I'm a big fan of that. I'm a big fan of the Narn regime ship designs. I think out of all the Babylon 5 vessels, they're some of the most thought out ones, similarly to the Warchan class that we see here fighting against our resource nodes. I think the Centauri are also very well represented in their ships, which I think is something that usually Babylon 5 isn't receiving all that much praise for. It's definitely not as prominent a part of the show as it is in places like Star Trek. Making this comparison, I think this mod does touch on something that I wish Babylon 5 and other sci-fi shows would be doing more, which is, if you are portraying these big interstellar empires, it is always quite nice when you get to see them fielding a bunch of auxiliary forces that are, part of the conquered peoples and the different colonies that they have. It gives the sense that these empires have been around for a long time, and I think it just makes for some of the most interesting stories, even looking at real-world history examples. If you imagine the British Empire throughout the World War, some of the most interesting parts of that are, of course, them calling in special forces and regiments from all kinds of different colonies that they have around the world, as far as Australia, India and such. And I wish we could see a little bit more of that here with the Centauri, not just getting the Draka as a reinforcement because they're secretly being taken over by them, but maybe fielding some of the other lesser members of their sort of protectorates and vassals throughout the empire. One of the few examples in science fiction that I can think of that actually does this would be the Gamela's empire over its space battleship Yamato, but that's a little bit more of a niche, I guess, than even this 30-year-old sci-fi show. Now, I wish I could say it's because we are sort of handicapping ourselves a little bit by just using Narn forces, or at least predominantly Narn forces, but the battles in this mod do tend to turn into a fight for attrition no matter what you do, because, well, it's either my playstyle or the mod being not particularly complex in terms of its balancing. It probably is a mixture of both, but I guess for the conflict that we're portraying here, it is quite fitting that both of these forces are just more or less grinding themselves down. We will start to field a little bit more of a heavier resistance still now that we've taken control over as much of the map as possible, and we are going to get some of these what looks to be like lighter cruisers of the Narn, which in the show we've seen as part of like the interconnected outpost that was one of the many places destroyed by the Shadows early on. That is one of these parts of the Narn aesthetic that I like, especially this feeling that their spacecraft are still modular. Their space stations are sometimes welded together from different hulls. It really leans into this very industrious and makeshift feeling that a lot of the Navy has going on. Especially with these smaller ships we're commanding right here that are very angular, very industrial, something that would feel right at home even in the Earth Alliance, compared to the much more organic, much more designed Jaquan cruisers that we'll get later on. We are going to try and engage in a little bit of a raid here, trying to take out enemy resource points. Not that the enemy in this game particularly has an economy that we can actually damage, but it does open up for us a little bit of a different maneuver, because the enemy will try and intercept forces attacking them. And especially for the Narn and the Centauri, that can open up some interesting opportunities, because the Centauri are quite nasty to take up front. All their ships have forward-facing weapons galore, but once you can outmaneuver them, they are not particularly well suited to a long height of attrition, which I guess is very true to what we learn in the show about them. And I do love this idea that these two major forces that we see fighting have these very adaptive, very contradicting doctrines, or not contradicting, but opposite doctrines that lend themselves to countering each other as best as possible. The Centauri trying to overwhelm the enemy with shock and awe, and the Narn just trying to hold out and prolong the conflict as long as possible. That being said, of course, we take our sweet time with episodes in Season 2 at the moment, but all in all, the entire Narn-Centauri conflict doesn't take very long, of course. It's about 6 months that it takes in the universe, and about that time for episodes airing, and that is, well, compared even to many real human wars that are just taking place on one planet, not a particularly long time, which I imagine can be largely attributed to the fact that we are talking about wars being fought primarily with spaceships here. Even the Limbari Earth Alliance war, even though it's very much the biggest conflict that humanity gets involved in this series up until the Civil War, if I remember correctly, it has a stated casualty count of 250,000 people, which is a lot, is a horrendous loss, especially if this is the personnel that was primarily stationed in space. But we have had bigger wars on just our own planet quite regularly. So this idea that wars are, in this sense, lower stakes, a quick and easy affair, I can imagine is part of the reason why they are so much more prevalent in the Babylon 5 universe again, and why the idea of invading a planet actually for a longer time, not just disabling things from orbit and taking it over, that this idea of holding territory on the ground is much, much more scary. And I think Babylon 5 throughout Season 2 leads us kind of in this direction, giving us this impression and gropus of just how nasty the on-ground ground pounder fighting actually is. With our new space station tier, we are moving up from our light cruisers here on towards the heavy cruisers that attack Ragesh 3. This beautiful design that looks like two Star Destroyers welded together, which from what I've seen in the behind-the-scenes stuff on these ship designs is more or less pretty much what happened. And it speaks to this entire idea that in Babylon 5 the art direction is so much more important than the visual fidelity of the models early on. They're just trying to create some striking silhouettes, which I think in a show like Babylon 5 that's trying to establish a new universe from scratch is very important, so that you can get not just to the point where story-wise the doctrines and the tactics of these different species are very distinct, but actually the portrayal of them also becomes very distinct, to the point where you can just take a look at these designs and identify them very easily as Babylon 5. Biding a hasty retreat with our small little frigate here, these are very good at taking out enemy fighters, and the sentry fighters are one of the big strengths that the Centauri have, but they are not very good at standing up in a frontal assault fight. For this we are going to need some of these heavier ships, and even our heavy cruiser here is not something that you will see holding out in a prolonged battle for very long. It's going to most of the time get routed all of its energy towards the beam weapons and try to take out as much of that as possible. We are of course getting graceful visits from the first drag vessels here. I love how alien these are by comparison to everything else, and the idea of encountering them as part of Centauri forces with no further comment, I think would have been a pretty terrifying sight for the Centauri to see. We imagine later on their kind of vengeance plots against the Centauri Republic when it is being taken over by the Watchers. Then of course Varus is in the far future still, and we are trying to fight this as much as we can with conventional weapons. Now here we are going to try and take advantage of the Centauri turning about and trying to claim control of the center of the map, and see if we can't flank them a little bit with some heavier vessels. They do get a lot of very uniform ships, unlike the Narn, where every vessel seems to be representing an entirely new generation of technology and design that goes into them, and only the very high-tier heavy cruisers for them seem to be very standardized and fully developed. For the Centauri, they do lean into this idea that it's a static force. They've been probably portraying the same style of vessels for a very long time, harkening back to the glory days of the Republic, of course. But in gameplay terms, the amount of different guns and shield generators they can slap on of these varies greatly, and Mark II and III of these wartime cruisers will be devastating to us if it sits somewhere and just saturates an entire area of space. The Army of Light, of course, switches its space station through the different component species. We have a Rey station, a Valkyrie station, and now we finally reached the Narn station. For role-playing sake, I guess I should stick to this stage of the development process, and I don't think we get much more Narn ships after this. But I think we will be upgrading just for security's sake, and maybe the chance to call in some Ranger support if all else fails. At least in this alternate timeline, we can imagine how things might turn out a little differently if only Jakar could convince everybody to lend a hand a bit earlier on before the homeworld gets spawned. Now, whenever the battle cam doesn't glitch into a wall, it gives us some beautiful shots of these heavy ships here. Of course, something that I will be trying to steal a little bit of inspiration from for some animations of my own at some point. We still have some assets for Narn and Centauri in our back pocket to try and maybe give some more atmospheric backgrounds as Babylon 5 goes further and further into wartime, that we will see more military vessels patrolling around the station later on, and maybe even some engagements. The Centauri are pushing now with an entire fighter wing at front. And we will let them do that as long as we can slip in behind the back. Our little vanguard ship there didn't survive for very long, but with some heavier guns we will at least start be able to mount a first assault on the space station and hopefully whittle down a good deal. Because this is originally a Star Wars mod or a Star Wars game, everything is of course functioning with shields, which are not really out of the show, and I'm actually quite fond of that. I like the idea of using armor and adaptive hulls and having to repair things in this much more physical way. This looks like a Centauri fighter just crashed into the engines of this Narn cruiser. I think they are getting a little bit more desperate. As long as our main resource nodes are holding, we will not have any issues calling in reinforcements and bolstering our numbers. We'll get to see in the final tally how many ships all in all we've thrown at this front just to eke out a victory. Probably a little bit more than what we ever get to see in the show, which is a continuing gripe I have with a lot of science fiction, that weirdly enough the scale of these conflicts is comparatively small. I mean, not just in terms of the length that these conflicts take or the numbers of casualties that are often listed, but in so many cases you have these portrayals of galaxy-spanning empires and the field fleets that are paling in comparison to even some naval fleets that we have on the ground here, with just a few dozen vessels going in and out. This is why I am a big fan of some of the older space operas, something like Legend of Galactic Heroes, where they take much more inspiration from Napoleonic Wars and just throw tens of thousands of spaceships in there with the Galactic Empire is fighting its rebels, and it takes on a much more operatic kind of style with massive formations moving around. Babylon 5 does get into this territory in movies like In the Beginning, and I think Third Space also starts going into this territory where the fleets get really, really big, and you get this portrayal that next to all the skirmishes and tactical conflicts that we get to see, eventually these big decisive battles of wars come down to massive, massive clashes of just raw industrial power and manpower that these different major factions are throwing at each other. And there, of course, the Shadow War will stand out once we get to see all the different species lending their ships, lending their little flotillas to join in with Babylon 5's own effort. I'm really excited for that, especially because I believe going into Season 3 and 4, the visual budget for these things will also take another jump, and we get to see a lot more action happening outside of the station. Whereas the Narn Centauri conflict, of course, is mostly a thing that we hear about, see in the people that visit the station and in reports they see, the newscasts that they see. And thematically, I think this makes a lot of sense, that it works really well that this isn't a conflict that Babylon 5 or anybody there is directly involved in, even though it has such huge repercussions for the entire history of this universe. But it also leaves it as one of these places where I always wish we would have a chance to see more stories. I think one of the more popular topics is always the telepath war, seeing how that turns out and how the entire Dark Plague happens, which of course is the Earth-centric side of the story, that big missing chapter between Babylon 5 and Crusade that we never got to see fully developed. But I think if we are looking into prequel territories or side spin-off stories that would be fun to see, I really wish we would ever get to see a little bit more of the Narn side, and this particular conflict, these 6 months of them getting ground down, and this sort of last conventional conflict that they're trying to engage in before the big, epic, mythical, galaxy-changing stories of the Shadow War start really happening. Our assaults on the space station have been thwarted for now. Once the Centauri turn around and concentrate on defending the territory, they are surrounding us quite quickly, so now it's kind of a cat-and-mouse game between different reinforcing flotillas and formations trying to get the upper hand. I am trying to send in some of the heavy fighters that the Narn have at their disposal, because they make for quite effective bombers, but they are really glass cannons, and this would in particular, where a frontal assault of any of the Warchans will take out an entire squadron of these fighters quite quickly. But if they can get close, and we can get them to bombard the space station for a little bit, they will do a lot of damage over time, and once they get close they can also survive for quite a good time longer. And with this in mind, we are mounting another assault, trying to get to release the last defenders of the Centauri, trying to get some more reinforcements on the way here, and starting to contemplate if not a call to the Warlords, or at least the Army of Light and their Warlord adjacent technology might not be able to quicken our victory here a little bit. Because we are holding the territory of the map quite well, but for the Narn to get this final push is still quite a challenge. Mostly fielding the heavy cruisers now with their iconic war pattern here. I do love when the spaceships resemble their species in these not too direct ways. I don't think these are exactly the kinds of patterns that you have on the Narn themselves, but the idea of this rat and black patterning on their hulls, almost like dazzle camouflage, it immediately calls to mind the red glowing quarters of Jakar, and I guess ever so often his bare chest in the bathrobe as he's walking around there. We are reenacting more or less the Western Front here, taking a little bit of territory, losing it again. Our push got called back. Now the Centauri are biting their teeth out at our forward resource gathering operation here, and as soon as we swing around this corn, it'll be a good opportunity to start another assault, maybe collect enough forces to make this happen. With our forward force now deployed, we can slowly start closing in on the enemy, and we will try and do so, gathering our forces as best we can, trying to amass enough of them so that we can take out the enemy. Of course, the Centauri are not going to idly stand by and wait for this, and now we get to slowly see just how bad the more advanced wartime can get. Although this Drag Mothership certainly doesn't stand up to much, these beam weapons of the Centauri showcasing that they are very well capable of damaging even organic technology. Something that we will see as sort of the smallest little triumph that they have at the Battle of Garage 7, which is the first time we see a shadow ship properly damaged and actually limping quite quickly away. It doesn't seem like they are particularly tough in their screaming vessels. Now that the battle is shifting closer to the space station, the battle cam will have some issue trying to follow these fighters around, which will casually phase in and out of existence here. But that shouldn't matter too much for us as we continue bombarding this place as much as we can from a little bit of distance away. We do have now access to the full roster, and if all else fails, we can always count on the ISH bailers out by calling in one of their massive capital ships, but we don't want it to come to that. We want to win this victory as best we can just with Centauri, with Narn forces, but much in the way that Longer would prefer for Centauri as well to reclaim the glory of the old days on their own terms. The Centauri station is now just about halfway there, so if we can just keep on the pressure on this assault, we might be able to break through here, at least get them into the dark orange. And to make this happen, we are trying to take some different angles, disperse the enemy as much as possible so that they can't concentrate their fire as easily. Despite Centauri fighters being described as some of the best around in the known universe, we are slowly clawing our way into some kind of space supremacy here just by the sheer amount of these things carried by our heavy cruisers. With some reinforcements still coming in, with a little bit of luck, this might be enough. The weapons effects in this mod are coupled together from things that are custom to this mod, and a lot of different uses for sound effects and visuals from the various Star Wars factions, some more eclectic things, also some of the German dubbing voice lines that you hear in the background talking about Star Destroyers and such are of course reuses, but I think it still gets this atmosphere very well across. Babylon 5 has this very stylized, very spectacular fireworks-ish effect for its space battles, and I think it is one of the best to do it in this way. Well, personally I do prefer a more, I don't want to say grounded approach because it involves a lot of fire, but the more simplistic approach taken by shows like Battlestar Galactica, where it's less colorful, less involving plasma and sparks and all that, but more fireballs and brimstone and smoke. Now, despite our best efforts, the Centauri have taken out the full extent of the heavy fleet that we tried to throw at them, but they are also pretty exhausted by the looks of it. They are now moving forward for one last time, trying to break through, but in terms of map control, this doesn't look particularly great for them. So now the Centauri are facing the same kind of conundrum that the Narn homeworld had at the end of its Centauri war, being able to hold out and making it very hard for the enemy to push in, but not being able to move on the offensive at all. Which puts us in the position of deciding how do we break this kind of uneasy stalemate without resorting to the barbarism of mass drivers. If we were playing as the Centauri, that, by the way, would be an option. They do get access to some of their retrofitted vessels, and I think the mod might even give a description of whether or not these are newly built, just for the case of this conflict, or if they are part of the old arsenal that the Centauri had just lying around, even though they are forbidden by a resourced world. It's always one of these often asked questions that I find quite fascinating about the conclusion of the Narn Centauri War. How much of this was planned by the Centauri in advance, and how well prepared were they to break all the rules to eke out this victory? Because as much as Londo's deal with the Shadows, of course, expedites this, makes this entire war and swift conclusion possible, what strikes me always about this conflict and its conclusion in the long Twilight struggle is how much of it is, at the end of the day, still down to the Narn losing the war of intelligence, like their messages being intercepted and their counterintelligence not being strong enough to recognize this in time, so that the entire operation gets found out. If that weren't the case, or if the Centauri weren't willing to utilize forbidden weapons of mass destruction, even the Shadow Allies alone wouldn't have turned the tide so quickly. And so from that perspective, I am inclined to believe that the Centauri had their own machinations going on, that eventually, even without the help of the Shadows, would have led to a similar outcome. Just probably not with Londo at the head of the operation, which might have at least made his personal fate a little bit better. Now, in an effort to not lose out everything again in the final assault, we are going to pull back our forces here towards the center a little bit, reclaim the center properly, rebuild some of the defenses here, just so that we can keep reinforcing and amassing a larger force at once. We just need to take care that the Centauri don't gain enough momentum, don't snowball into a force that will decimate us even before reaching their main station. But for this particularly, the defensive stations and the little mines that we are building up in the center here are a good distraction. And we'll be able to keep them busy just for long enough that we can hopefully push through. And of course we are moving away from the Narn-only fleet composition that we had going on for most of this matchup, and we have called in at least 2 White Stars for reinforcements. And we can imagine that one of these maybe has Bryan Cranston on board and he survives a little bit longer than with this final mission that he will eventually have to fly against the Shadows. For this might be a little bit of a moment of glory as the Rangers probably secretly help out a little bit in this battle, trying to even the odds against the less conventional Centauri units like the Dark Vessels and the odd Shadow Scout that has been messing about in this battle, trying to tip the scales. Now, because our heavy ships are not going to withstand concentrated bombardment for too long, we are going to try and throw our fighters in, not just as escorts, but as an actual assault wing, call in some extra heavy cruisers on the side, and then try and bombard this place into oblivion finally. Give them a little bit of their own medicine back. And we get some of these nice little shots of the various different fighter designs for the Narn that are doing their best to throw in their weight into this battle. And at last it looks like the Centauri have exhausted their reserves at least a little bit. Gonna have to turn around here and see that we don't get blown up from the back all too quickly, but I think the station by this point is too far gone and we are getting very, very close now to celebrating our victory. And have at least a little bit of payback, a small reprieve, maybe get a few refugees out to carry some important intel to Franklin before the inevitable end. And that end of the Narn Centauri conflict is of course what we will be looking at very soon. Hopefully next week already we will get to our proper discussion of the long Twilight struggle. Until then, I hope you enjoyed this little excursion into the world of Babylon 5's Empire at War mod. I do enjoy showcasing this every so often just because I think it's a beautiful work of fan admiration for the setting, and yeah, these older strategy games deserve a little bit of love as well.